This will be a two-part tutorial in which we'll create a brick-lined maze in Maya and then an animated camera that will take us through that maze. We're going to start by creating a simple Polygon Q. Go to Create, Polygon Primitives, Cube, and then click in your viewport. I'm going to my top view, and in my top view I'm going to center this cube and then scale it to fit 4 units. Now I'll go over to my channel window. I'll click through XYZ Translate, punch in 0, and then hit Return. Now I'll hit R on the keyboard and I'll scale that so that it is comprised of 4 units in my viewport. I'm going to return to my 4 views, and I'd like to go into one of my side views, side or the front, either orthographic view will do, and I'm going to move the pivot down to the bottom of the cube. I'll hold down D, and if I hold the V, I can now grab the y-axis and I can snap it to the bottom of the cube, and that's going to allow me to now move it so that it rests on my z-axis. So I'll hold down X after I hit W, and I'll click and drag it up. So if I go to my perspective view, my cube is sitting on the X, Y, Z axes. Now we're going to extrude 2 adjacent faces so that we will have essentially an L shape. And we're going to use our Extrude Poly tool to do this. Now the Extrude Poly tool looks like this little orange cube, rectangular type cube on a plane. If you don't see that on your shelf, you'll need to hold down Command Shift, go to Edit Mesh, and choose Extrude. I'm going to right click and choose Face and select 2 adjacent faces. Now I want to extrude those 2 out to make the L shape. So once they're selected, I'll click on my Extrude tool. Now over here I have the Poly Extrude window that has popped up, and I'm going to click on Keep Faces Together instead of On. I'm going to click and turn them off. By turning off the Keep Faces Together, I can now move my polygon faces out equally in either direction. I'm going to move both of them out 4 units. 1, 2, 3, 4. Once I've got the L I want, I'm going to right click and choose Face again, and I'm going to delete the faces that I don't need, essentially opening this up to look like a basic hallway. Once I have the face selected, I'll hit Delete. As you can see now, we've got the basic component that we'll need to make that maze. I'll go to Lighting, and I'll choose two-sided lighting, and I'll go back to my object mode. This geometry is going to be repurposed again and again, so the first thing I would do is put a texture on it, so when I duplicate it I don't have to retexture each new piece that I make. I'll right click on the selected geometry, I'll choose Assign New Material, going to Arnold, AI Standard, and I'm going to name it, and I'm going to take the specular weight down to 0 because I don't want this to be a shiny surface. It's going to be brick and cement. So I'll drag the weight to 0. I'll hit Return to set the name of this new texture, and then I'll follow the color node out under Base to the checkerboard pattern. And if I don't see the checkerboard pattern immediately, I'll select my geometry in the viewport and hit 6 on the keyboard. Now we're going to use automatic mapping to set up our faces. The first thing I'm going to do though is delete by type history. If you don't have a shelf with that, you would go to Edit, Delete by type history. I'll hold down my space bar, I'll go to UV, and I'll go to Automatic. I'm going to go to the UV editor. The UV editor, if you recall, is a green box with a checkerboard in it. If you don't see that, you would go to UVs, and the very first choice, UV editor, will give you that tool. I'm going to select it, and if I've got my geometry selected, I'm going to see the components inside the UV editor. The white squares and black squares are perfectly shaped. So I'll turn off the checkerboard reference inside the UV, so now I can see the UV maps that have been generated. Now we're going to go in and select the UV maps for each of the walls. And when we do that, under UV shell, we can select them and we look at our model and we can see the reference inside our viewport. So my objective is to put all of the UV maps representing the walls of this maze on top of each other so I can minimize the amount of texturing that I need to do. The easiest way to stack all these UV shells is start to select them and pull them out from the main square where the checkerboard is. And each time I roll over a UV shell now, it will reflect it inside the geometry. So I will go and select these and start to stack them one on top of the other as carefully as I can. If need be, I'll hit F on the keyboard and I'll be as precise as I can. Now I'm going to go and stack all the UV maps for the walls together, and then when we return we'll gather in the floor and the walls into this central checkerboard area so we can export our UV map and develop our texture in Photoshop. If we look at the UV editor now that I've stacked all my walls, I can see that if I marquee select all the UV maps, all the walls are selected and the floor is not. So that will be our cement surface and all the walls will have a brick pattern. Now with all the UV maps selected in the UV editor, I'll click and drag them into the corner where the checkerboard is along with the floor. Now you might find yourself scaling these up a bit so that you can maximize the quality of the texture itself. So I'll put that there, shift select the floor, and then maybe I'll just scale it up a little bit more. Once I've got my UV maps inside the checkerboard area, I will right click on my geometry in the viewport, go back to my object mode. Once I've gone to the object mode, I can now return to the UV editor and I'll go to Image, UV Snapshot. And in here you'll want to make sure that you direct this UV skin into your folder. Once I've saved it, I'm going to make sure the image format is a ping, and I'm going to set the size of the PNG 1024 by 1024, and I'll click on Apply and Close. Now we're ready to go into Photoshop to develop our texture. I've opened up my UV map inside of Photoshop, and in a previous tutorial we learned how to generate texture maps. So the UV maps here in the right hand corner represent our brick walls, and I've developed a brick pattern and scaled it proportionally to what I wanted and placed it over all of them collectively. And down here I've created a texture that kind of resembles a cement floor. Once I've generated my texture, I'll turn off the UV map and save, and I'll return to Maya. Now that I'm back in Maya, I'm going to go to the material attribute. And in the material attribute, I will go to where it says color. I'll right click over the word color and choose break connection. I'll go back out through the color node, and then I'm going to choose file under create render node, and I'll go out and get the texture that I generated. Once I've applied my texture, I can now duplicate these surfaces to create a maze. I'm going to right click and I'm going to choose face, and I'm going to select 3 faces on either end of the L. I'll hold down the space bar, I'm going to go to edit mesh, and I'm going to choose extract. And what I've just done is I've pulled out that separate surface. So now I can duplicate as many of these straight pieces that I'll need. Now once I've created one straight piece, I'll go back to the original geometry, shift select the extracted left hand leg of this L, select the rest of it, and by going to mesh, combine, I can reattach them. So now I've got my original L, and then I've got the straight run that will give me the pieces I need to to create hallways between these turns. Now I'm going to create a basic maze, and when I come back, we'll create a path and attach a camera and animate the camera through the hallways.